So, good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Mehlaka Samdani. I am with the Community Alliance for Peace and Justice, an advocacy group that works to impact policy and public opinion on issues related to the Middle East and South Asia. This event is co-sponsored by Massachusetts Peace Action, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to develop sustained political power to foster a more just and peaceful U.S. foreign policy. A little more than a year ago, Hamas's deadly attack on October 7th left more than 1,100 people dead, and an additional 250 people were taken hostage. On that same day, the Israeli government began the systematic slaughter of the Palestinian people. Backed by the Biden administration, the resulting genocide perpetrated by the Israeli government has killed more than 43,000 Palestinians, injured more than 100,000, and displaced almost 2 million people multiple times. As Israel's assault on Gaza expands to Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and now potentially Iran, we are here to take stock of the situation in Gaza, the region, and beyond, and are joined by three distinguished guests. First, we have Laila El Haddad, who is an award-winning Palestinian author, social activist, and policy analyst. She frequently speaks on the situation in Gaza, the intersection of food and politics, her own personal journey as a Palestinian mother and journalist, as well as on contemporary Islam. She has written for numerous publications, including the Washington Post, International Herald Tribune, and has appeared on many networks, including NPR, CNN, Al Jazeera, and CCTV. Next, we have Trita Parsi, who is the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute. He is an expert on Iran-US relations and has authored 3 books on US foreign policy in the Middle East, with a particular focus on Iran and Israel. He was named by the Washingtonian magazine as one of the 25 most influential voices on foreign policy in Washington, D.C. in both 2021 and 2022, and preeminent public intellectual Noam Chomsky calls Parsi one of the most distinguished scholars on Iran. Last but not least, we have Peter Beinart. He is a professor of journalism and political science at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York. He is an editor-at-large at Jewish Currents, a contributing opinion columnist at the New York Times, a political commentator for MSNBC, and a fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. He also writes the Beinart Notebook, a weekly newsletter. His forthcoming book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, will be published in January 2025. Thank you all so much for joining us today. So before we begin, I'm just going to quickly go over the format of our discussion for our audience. So for the first half of this event, I'm going to ask our speakers a series of questions, after which we will turn it over to audience Q&A. We request that you make your questions short and concise so that we can get to as many as possible. And also, if you could add them to the Q&A function here on Zoom, that would be wonderful. So without further ado, I'm going to now turn to Laila. Laila, let me first thank you again for coming. As a Palestinian American with family in Gaza, how have you coped with the trauma of the past year, and where have you found the strength to keep going?
Thank you so much for having us, first of all. And, I get asked this question a lot, and a whole reel of the past 12 months plays out through my head, honestly, because it's not an easy question to answer. We, especially those of us who are from Gaza, who have family in Gaza, who are here in the country aiding and abetting the genocide of our family in Gaza, are in a very sort of unusual situation where we are seeing before our eyes the most well-documented genocide play out, live streamed before our eyes, and feel powerless to do anything about it. And at the same time, obligated to do something about it. And at the same time, checking in on our family members, and many of us being the only lifeline for those family members. all while at the same time having to continuously sort of really just man all fronts, or woman all fronts, if you will. At the same time, continuously justify our humanity or respond to various, letters being put out on the micro, local, regional to the national, whether it's, my daughter's high school or community college or the hospital where my husband works, or on a, um, call and correct and explain, field media calls. And it's all something we're happy to do, but it's exhausting because often, speaking for myself and many in our community, we're having to motivate and call to action and so on and organize. And often we are literally falling apart inside and seeing everything that we know and that we love being destroyed and erased, right? Physically, literally, and figuratively. Starting off with literally our deaths being negated, our lives and value, our lives and humanity being erased, our suffering obfuscated, everything about us sort of devalued in the most, perverse and deliberate of ways, that leaves you constantly, questioning, feeling like the ground is moving beneath you, questioning your reality in a way. You're living this kind of dystopian world where every morning you wake up and you think, is this really happening? How could it be? And then you kind of snap yourself out of it and go, onwards. We don't have the luxury to grieve or ponder or analyze or intellectualize about it because there's lives at stake. And there's much more than lives at stake. It almost feels like humanity itself, in a way, is at stake. So, I mean, that's just kind of a summary of what it's been like. If I could give you a glimpse into my mind, where we wake up and check our WhatsApp groups and we go to sleep and we see the constantly rolling list of, virtual morgues of who was killed and who wasn't, and who's, low on, nourishment, literally. I mean, I have half my family in the north, half in the middle areas. Who needs what? Who's, no longer in reach? Has anyone new been killed? What are the needs? And at the same time, they're insisting they're okay, and just keep doing what you're doing. That's the best thing you can do for us. And yeah, so it's exhausting but necessary. And there's a real urgency that perhaps there was always a need to, constantly, what sort of informed my whole life's work is this need to convey both the story of Gaza, as it were, to narrate that experience as a way to understanding the broader Palestinian struggle. And it all seems to have come down to this, right? And of course, again, I just also want to, on a final note, add that this is something that has been ongoing long before. I know we feel this need. This is another frustration to always center the conversation, start the conversation on October 7th. And sorry, but it bugs the hell out of me because that really does a huge disservice to everyone who has any stake in this.
Absolutely. Laila, thank you for that. Late last year, you were one of the plaintiffs in a lawsuit filed by the Center for Constitutional Rights against President Biden, Blinken, and Defense Secretary Austin for their complicity in and failure to prevent the unfolding genocide in Gaza. Could you describe what that process was like for you and what that case represented for you as a Palestinian?
Yes, it came at a time when still fairly early on. I still can't believe that it's been a year, more than a year now. And I think maybe foolishly, naively, many of us felt, it can only go so far, right? And we were all, not that I'm necessarily jaded and have thrown in the towel, but my point is we still felt there was there was more hope, let's say, than we feel now, in terms of, trying to sort of cut the losses, as it were, put it end to it as quickly as we could. And so we were really doing everything we could, we being, anyone involved in the organizing, and those of us especially who had family in Gaza, and using all tools at our disposal, right? Everything in the toolbox. And this just happened to be one of them, political, legal, and so on. And so there were several of us. Of course, I wasn't the only plaintiff. But it was, in terms of, I'm sorry, the question was what was the experience like, or what was involved? I can't
Sure.
remember.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, and there was a lot going on at that moment in time when we first became aware of the possibility of the lawsuit. And as the months went on, so much was happening so quickly. This was in November when we first, got involved. And it also coincided with, the killing of several of my direct and very close family members, my aunts and my cousins, on an Israeli airstrike on their home in Gaza City. And so everything was still very raw. And I mean, I didn't hesitate to get involved. And it was a very, I would say, empowering experience, is maybe the correct word. Because what I keep saying is, and I know this is probably one of your next questions, but you need to do something with that rage, and that incredible sadness and despair and despondence that you feel. And if you don't, it will consume you. And so this was one of those things that we felt we could do, to be able to advocate on behalf of our families, continue to raise awareness about what was going on, to be able to narrate our own experiences. And it was really incredible. I think none of us knew what to expect going in. Of course, one of our co-plaintiffs was in Gaza. He was able to live stream in to the court, which was amazing. Another, Ahmed Abortama, whose life was literally, he was being targeted at the time. His son had just been killed in a strike that was thought to have been targeting him. And so he couldn't actually appear. He was trying to hide for a while or seek some shelter. But none of us knew what to expect. And this was also, I should add, on the heels of, just a few weeks after Biden had made these infuriating remarks in which he was sort of essentially casting doubt on the actual deaths of Palestinians, that, casting doubt on the notion that Palestinians had even been killed, right? The truthfulness of us as a people, something we continue to see, of course, in the media, right? It's always like, one of I think the most absurd headlines was like, some Palestinians dead, Gazans say, or something, right? It's always like, maybe, perhaps, according to them, but as we know them, they are not trustworthy. So it was on the heels of him making these comments, parroting some of the Israeli propaganda. And so we were literally made to feel like here we were being genocided, but also we were, total gaslighting, right? that this wasn't happening. Everything you see, don't believe your lying eyes, is not happening, right? So in that sense, being able to go and address the judge, who gave us this sort of unlimited time, which was also very unexpected. He said, I'm not going to interrupt any of you. I want you to take as much time as you need. And to just be able to tell him how we're feeling, and then to have him say that, you have been heard, and to be able to speak at length, some of us, about our parents and grandparents' Nakba experience, to explain what that meant to the judge, to have that on the record, to have him also overrule every time the US government lawyers were attempting to object to the expert witness, Dr. Barry Trachtenberg, to have every time they tried to object, to have that overruled. I mean, I want to say it was gratifying, but it felt good. I won't lie. We felt for the first time in months we had been heard. Somebody was taking us seriously. And I always remind people, our job as people who are organizing and advocating and disrupting and trying to affect change, is to do the work. We can't always guarantee the results, but is to do the work. And this was part of that work, without guaranteeing the results, to continue to build pressure, to build this critical mass, to change the narrative, to disrupt the narrative, very importantly, even if you're not changing it. So it was really something very beautiful, I want to say. We came out of there for the first time feeling re-energized, being also with others that had been experiencing the same thing, and even if they had it in solidarity, was healing in a way.
Sure. And this was sort of coincided with the ICJ's provisional ruling
Yes,
as
by
well, right?
total coincidence. It was on the same exact day. It was not planned that way, but yes, and that helped, I think, in the sense that it, of course, political question doctrine came into play, but it helped in the sense that the judge still made Judge White made these incredible remarks where he said, were I not bound by political question? And, there was a different, the preferred outcome of the court would have been different, but recognize that there's this plausible genocide, and pleaded with the Biden administration to sort of course correct, and said it's the obligation of sort of every person out there to do what they can to put an end to this military siege, as he called it.
Sure. And when did the final ruling come out? And what became of the case then?
That is a question for the lawyers. It's that, as again, political question came into play, but the job of the lawyer was to continually challenge that, as it is with any kind of lawyer and any kind of, try to create a precedent and say, if there is something like this happening, right? There is a very well documented case of genocide happening, very well documented instances in which the U.S. government is aiding and abetting and not preventing, not fulfilling their role to stop this genocide from unfolding. Then, if political question doctrine comes into play, in other words, the courts can't intervene with the executive foreign policy, then what does that say about our policy, that we can essentially allow a genocide to unfold and that we have no recourse, right? There's nothing we can do to stop it. That's what they were trying to argue. And, he still said political question, and it went on to an appeal, and fortunately some very conservative judges. And I think it's in some kind of motion right now that I can't really speak too much at length about, but it's ongoing. But again, it was more to be able to say this was something that was openly discussed 4 hours, that is now on the record, that is continuing to put pressure on the government, that has Biden cited as someone, the first president being accused of aiding and abetting, of being complicit in a genocide, the first president in history. So all of this, I think, does this combined with that, it's very hard for us, I think, to be able to see with our narrow lens what the impact of all these actions are. But I'd like to believe, I have to believe, because hope is our only refuge and our only option right now, that all of this amounts to something. And one day we will look back and say, because what's the alternative, right? Total despair. And we just kind of, essentially cave to the finality of genocide.
Sure. I mean, you talked about hope, and I'm wondering, over the past year, and it's so hard to see the light in all of this carnage, but have you seen any positive shifts towards the Palestinian cause here in the US, whether in the court of public opinion, media coverage, among congressional leaders that you might have met with? What is giving you hope in this moment?
I mean, depends on the time of day you ask me and what's going on. But as a person of deep faith, I mean, that's what grounds me. That's what keeps me going. It's my sacred duty to continuously change, any injustice that I see before me, whatever that might be, whether it's through direct action or, the Islamic tradition is that the weakest level of faith is simply feeling that something is wrong, being sort of a passive observer in your heart. And I hope that that's none of us here. And the strongest level of faith is sort of being hands-on and doing whatever you can. So that's what kind of guides me, I would say.
Sure.
And what gives me hope, I mean, also is honestly, it's ironic, but speaking to my family and my friends and others that I've come to know in Gaza, whenever I'm feeling really down and whenever I speak to them, whether it's in interviews or just conversation, there was a young girl that I spoke with recently, 21-year-old, who said, people have this mistaken notion that we in Gaza need the world, or we need people. And she said, I can't speak for everyone, but I can speak for myself when I tell you it's not us who needs the world, it's the world who needs us. And she said, we've come to terms with the fact that no one is going to help us except, you know, in her case, she was a devout Muslim, except, you know, God Almighty, but essentially that we can only help ourselves, you know, along with God. Um, and so we've come to terms with that, but it's the world who needs us because Gaza has become the world's moral compass.
Absolutely.
And it's sort of the litmus test, the barometer that will determine which side of humanity, which side, you know, of this equation you fall on. And I think back to that, and I think of all of my family and friends who are enduring the, you know, the unspeakable right now, just new depths of horror every day. And so I don't have the luxury to sit here again and worry about what I feel. I don't have the luxury to despair, I guess. And so in that, hope is my only refuge. I find hope in my faith and looking back sort of at the long arc of history, and thinking about my family members.
Sure. Laila, thank you so much. And we will come back to you with, I'm sure there'll be so many questions in the audience as well. Really, really appreciate your sort of sharing with us what you're feeling at this moment. We were going to turn to Peter, but Peter, unfortunately, Trita has to step off after a little bit. He has a live MSNBC interview that he needs to do. So I'm going to turn to him if you don't mind first. Trita, you know, welcome and thank you for being here. So we've seen a dangerous expansion of the war in recent weeks with Israel's killings of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, Hassan Nasrallah in Beirut, and Israel's ongoing bombing in Lebanon. We've also seen Iran's retaliatory attack on Israel's soil with almost 200 missiles that were sent there on October 1st. Israel has vowed it will respond. What shape do you think this retaliation will take, and what kind of support will the US administration, in your mind, will provide if and when Israel attacks Iran?
Thank you so much, Nalaga, and thank you for all of you who are tuning in. It's a great pleasure to be in this gathering with you and with Laila and Peter. As to your question, on the first part, I would say in some ways it does not matter how the first round of retaliation or response from Israel ends up looking. Because by now, I think it's quite clear it is not going to be a one-off. So for instance, the White House has essentially told the Israelis, even showed them specific targets in Iran that the White House believes would be acceptable. These would be military targets, and that would avoid the Israelis attacking the nuclear sites or economic infrastructure, such as oil installations. And the Israelis have reluctantly agreed to this, but it doesn't matter, to be frank with you, because once the Israelis hit these military targets, particularly if they also seek to assassinate key figures within the IRGC, similar to what they have done in Lebanon, then the Iranians will certainly respond. And whatever was avoided in the first round will surely come as a response or as an attack in the second or third round. So we are in an escalatory cycle. Where exactly in that cycle we begin at the end of the day may not be that relevant. What's relevant is if the Biden administration actually does something to stop the cycle. And so far, in my estimation, what the Biden administration has done has actually fueled the cycle. Let me explain. Whenever Israel has chosen to escalate, such as killing Haniyeh in Tehran on the inauguration of the new president, or killing Hassan Nasrallah, or invading Lebanon, or earlier on when they struck the Iranian embassy compound in Damascus. These are clear, known escalatory steps. The Biden administration has said that they do not wish to see any escalation. They do not wish to see any expansion of the war. Yet whenever Israel has done this, the Biden administration has come to Israel's defenses in order to protect it from the consequences of its own escalation. By that, it has reduced the cost for Israel to escalate, which then has made it easier for Israel to escalate. Had Biden not done this, the cost would have been higher to Israel to escalate. It would have forced Israel to think twice. And perhaps the cost would even have been prohibitive. But by reducing the cost, Biden, willingly or unwillingly, has actually made it easier for Israel to escalate. And as a result, we should not be surprised that we are in this situation right now. We are then at the same time in a window, the next 2 or 3 weeks, in which the Netanyahu government is most likely to try to escalate dramatically for a variety of reasons. Contrary to a lot of speculation that the Israelis would like to see Trump elected, which I'm not necessarily questioning, but I think the Israelis are quite aware at the same time that Trump is unpredictable. And he may very well come down and say, you know what, enough is enough. I don't want to see more of this. I don't think it's because he has any particular empathy for any side here, but I do think that he doesn't like to be dragged into things that he does not control, when he is not in the driving seat of the car. And as a result, may actually react much stronger than the Biden administration has done and what the Kamala Harris administration may do. So escalating now, before that happens, is much more preferable for the Netanyahu government. Moreover, the fact that it will likely bring about the Trump presidency, I don't believe that that would be against Netanyahu's wishes. My point is, it's not as if he's waiting for Trump to come in order to widen the war. He needs to widen it much before that in order to maximize his maneuverability and minimize the maneuverability of the next American president. So I think that we're likely going to see some dramatic escalation right before the elections, meaning any day now in the next 3 weeks. And particularly with the Biden administration deciding to send THAAD anti-missile defense systems to Israel, which then also included about 100 US servicemen and women, which means that Americans are now in the war zone per the decision of Biden. And these batteries now actually became operational today. I think we have now truly entered the phase of dramatic risk for further escalation.
Right, and the Israeli government just came out and said that we will attack before the election, and you've said that military personnel, U.S. military personnel, are already in the theater of war at this point, or
Yes,
are they in the process
because of the decision that Biden made of sending the THAADs, which incidentally also is then an admission that the Iron Dome, the Arrow 1, 2, 3, the David Sling, all of these different anti-aircraft systems have not been sufficiently effective vis-a-vis the Iranian missile attacks against Israel. So Israel has significant vulnerabilities, yet the decision is to continue to escalate and continue to enable the Israelis to escalate.
Right. So, but what about the surrounding countries, Trita? And what has been the response of the Gulf states regarding increasing tensions between Iran and Israel? I mean, historically, they have not seen Iran in very favorable terms. But in this moment, do you see them supporting Iran if attacked by Israel, and what kind of support could they provide?
There's been a shift in the attitude of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Earlier on, they were actually right there with Israel, pressuring and lobbying the US government to go to war with Iran. That has changed for a variety of reasons, including their realization of Iran's capability to really strike their countries. And these countries know very well that they cannot count on the type of support and protection that the US is providing Israel. That will never be extended to them in the same way. So they're now in a situation in which they do not wish to see any further escalation because they fear that they will be dragged into the war. So for instance, part of the reason why the US is opposed to Israel attacking oil infrastructure is not just because of the impact of oil prices, the impact of that on the elections, etc., but it's also because the Iranians have made very explicit threats to these countries. If the United States strikes, if Israel strikes Iran's oil installation, particularly if it uses any of the air bases in the GCC countries, Iran will also target their oil installations and create a much more massive disaster economically. These countries do not want to get dragged into this. They don't have a favorable view of Iran. They don't have a favorable view of Israel necessarily either. But they recognize that at this point, we're not talking about minor skirmishes. This will be a war that will drag most of the region into it. And they understandably do not want to be part of that.
Sure. With Hamas and Hezbollah severely undermined the way they have been over the past several weeks. What do you think Iran's approach will be now vis-a-vis Israel and its support of the Palestinian people?
I think, first of all, it is without doubt, of course, clear that Hamas has clearly suffered, although, of course, the Palestinian people in Gaza have suffered far, far more than Hamas does. Hezbollah has also been set back, but I think the spectacular nature of the pager attack against Hezbollah, which undoubtedly had a huge impact on their communication system, has created a bit of a hubris on the Israeli side as well as on the Western side, in which essentially it is viewed as if Hezbollah has been completely degraded, and as a result, all the Israelis need to do is to go in and finish the job. I do not think that that is where it is. The estimation of their missile arsenal indicates that they probably have roughly half of them left. They may not be in a position to be able to fire them at the wide range as they could earlier on, meaning that they would be able to fire a very large number of them simultaneously, but they've nevertheless shown their capacity of being able to hit Israel nevertheless. We just saw that with the attack a couple of days ago. So I think very quickly a sense of hubris took over part of Washington as well as Israel. And we saw Israeli officials openly saying that this is an opportunity to change the face of the Middle East. All of this kind of hubris, delusionary idea of how once again Western powers can change the nature and the geopolitical composition of the Middle East through force. All of these things going back to the Bush administration suddenly came back in. Just as much as those were delusional back then, I think they're quite delusional today as well. So I do not think that we're in a situation in which these forces have been completely degraded to the point in which, let's have a day after plan, as if the war already has been won.
Sure. And what about the Houthis, though? I mean, how do you think they're going to be responding in all of this?
Well, the Houthis have continued to strike both against ships in the Red Sea, but as well as against Israel. And none of the massive bombardment of the United Kingdom and the United States has actually deterred them. So I think at the end of the day, this was quite foolish in the first place to believe that it would end up, getting them to back down when they believe so firmly that their demand is not only morally right, but also grounded in international law. The demand of Hezbollah, the demand of the Houthis was a ceasefire in Gaza. The Houthis even cited the Genocide Convention and pointed to the responsibility of states to prevent a genocide as a justification for the actions that they were taking. I think we really should be asking ourselves that over the course of the last 12 months, so much of this suffering in Gaza, so much of the escalation in the region, so much of the widening of the war could have been avoided so easily if there simply was a ceasefire in Gaza. Instead, we saw the Biden administration put emphasis and tried almost everything else except putting pressure for an actual ceasefire. And in the region, this is clearly recognized and understood. And that's why increasingly the narrative is that this is not Israel's war, this is Israel and America's war.
Sure. Do you think we're going to see any difference at all, depending on who wins in November? In terms
I
of
do think, I think in both cases, there will be some differences. I don't believe that the Harris administration is on board with this current approach. The question is not whether they agree with it or not. I'm pretty confident that they don't. The extent to which they disagree, of course, is a good area for debate. The question is, will the Harris administration have the strength to be able to chart a different course? And that remains to be seen. Of course, depends both on her own persona, the people that she brings into government. In the case of Trump, I don't think, again, that he is some sort of a peace snake or that any of those different things. But I do believe that he does not like to see the escalation risk and the risk of the US getting dragged into something that he's not interested in because it doesn't benefit him personally. And I do wonder, would Netanyahu have had the same comfort defying Trump as he has had defying Biden? So I do think that there are different scenarios that will emerge then. I frankly really have a hard time seeing the situation being worse than it has been under Biden.
Sure. And I mean, I'm sure there'll be questions around, the normalization efforts that with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and some of the other Gulf states, and we can come back to it. I know you have to hop off for about 15 minutes to do your interview. So thank you so much, Trita. And
thank you for having me. I'll be back soon.
okay, great. Thank you. We look
Thank
forward
you.
to it. Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for your patience. Peter, in October of last year, there was a Hebrew University poll that found 77% of Israeli respondents believed the war in Gaza would unify Israeli society. And yet, in the ensuing months, we've seen tens of thousands of Israelis protest across Israel against Netanyahu and in support of a hostage deal and a ceasefire. What fractures over the past year have you observed? And do you believe there is more, or is there less support now for Palestinian rights and freedoms within Israel than there was before?
Thanks. So I think the first thing to remember when one talks about Israeli society is that 20% of Israel's citizens are Palestinians. So I think we're really most talking about Jewish Israeli society, because Palestinian citizens, as one could imagine, see things very differently. I think that there are very deep and profound divisions among Israeli Jews, but tragically, they're not really about the question of Palestinian rights and Palestinian freedom. The questions that deeply divide Israeli Jews are about the nature of the relationship between religion and state as it regards Israeli Jews. There's a very, very bitter culture war between more secular and more religious Israeli Jews, which played itself out in this struggle over the kind of emasculation of the Supreme Court. And then there is another divide, a very bitter divide, about whether there should be a pause in the war in Gaza in order to get hostages returned, with many hostages' families leading an effort to get some kind of deal so that the remaining hostages who are alive will be returned. And they've had very, very bitter confrontations with the Israeli government over this question, and many of them are furious that Netanyahu did not agree to a deal that would have allowed their families to return. So these divides are very bitter, but they're within a certain ideological range, and that ideological range is really about the welfare and interests of Israeli Jews, not, I say this with great sadness, not really about the rights and dignity of Palestinians. There is a group of Israeli Jews who believe the war is morally wrong and oppose it on that basis, but that's a much, much smaller group of people. That's not a group of people that has really political influence in Israel. Those people, I think, are very heroic, but they are politically quite marginal.
Okay, so I'm also wondering if we just sort of come to the question of the American Jewish community here. In a recent opinion piece, you wrote about the great rupture in American Jewish life. And could you please describe what that is and how that has manifested over the past year here in America?
Sure. So I think two of the defining characteristics ideologically of American Jews, going back for the last 50 years at least, have been a certain kind of commitment to American liberalism, not maybe leftism or radicalism, but liberalism in the sense that American Jews vote overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party, which is actually unusual since most American Jews are considered white. Most white Americans don't vote overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party. The Jews are kind of politically anomalous in their commitment to the Democratic Party's vision of America, which at least in theory is equality under the law. And yet American Jews institutions have also been defined by a very, very strong commitment to Israel, to its existence as a Jewish state, and indeed to the policies of its governments. And my argument in that piece was that there's a very deep ideological tension, even you could say contradiction, between these two principles. How can you say that your political identity is wrapped up with the idea of equality under the law in the United States, and still be so passionately supportive of Israel, when Israel is based on a kind of Jewish legal privilege, Jewish legal supremacy over Palestinians? But I don't think that American Jews and other Americans, for that matter, most of them have had to face that didn't have to face that contradiction as much in the past, because Palestinian voices were so marginalized, were so off stage. As Edward Said wrote, Palestinians lacked permission to narrate. I think as Palestinian voices have grown more prominent in the United States, it has a group of American Jews have become more aware of the ideological contradiction between the liberalism in the United States and the support for kind of a project of Jewish supremacy. And so where you see that emerging is among younger people in particular, not only, but there's a very, very stark a generational divide that exists among American Jews. Not that all young American Jews have fundamental problems with the idea of a Jewish state, or are concerned about Palestinian freedom, but there is a large enough chunk that the Zionist consensus, the consensus besides Jewish statehood, which is starting to fracture. And so what you have inside American Jewish spaces, again, this is very different from Israel. This is not happening in Israel, but in the United States, you have something like a kind of an ideological civil war that exists in American Jewish communities, and it plays out often along generational lines, and it often also plays itself to some degree along religious lines, because Orthodox American Jews tend to be much more pro-Israel and also now voting mostly Republican, while more secular American Jews are much more critical of Israel. And so this divide this divide is really, you can see it within many of the institutions and even inside many Jewish families.
Great. So yeah, and I mean, how has that sort of, manifest on college campuses? We've saw so many of those protests and encampments, and there was a lot of, many of the sort of pro-Palestinian protests that have happened have been led, in fact, I mean, mostly by Palestinians, of course, but also by young Jewish Americans. And I'm wondering, Jewish Voice of Peace, and if not now, how is that seen? What impact has that movement had on the American Jewry's response to what's going on in Israel right now, but also how is that seen within Israel when you see thousands of young Jewish Americans coming to protest against Zionism and Israel itself?
I mean, I think the dominant discourse in Israel among Israeli Jews is that all this is just anti-Semitism, and to the degree that there's some Jews involved in it, those Jews are self-hating Jews who are at best completely deluded, and if not, basically enemies of the Jewish people, right? I think that's the dominant discourse, unfortunately, in Israel. In the United States, it's a bit different. The mainstream American establishment Jewish organizations also describe this phenomenon fundamentally as anti-Semitism. And by the way, there is some anti-Semitism, right? But it also completely misses the point to basically see expression of desire for Palestinian life, humanity, freedom as anti-Semitism, right? Just because someone might say something anti-Semitic here and there at a protest doesn't make the core message anti-Semitic. The core message is about humanity, right? There are, I think, where you see on campuses, you see the epicenter of how deep this Jewish division is. There are lots of Jewish students on campus who do find these protests extremely threatening. They do feel that they're anti-Semitic, and they feel that they are making them, as Jewish students who support Israel, into kind of pariahs on campus, and they feel very, very beleaguered by this. On the other hand, as you said, the Jewish students also tend to be overrepresented in these protests movements, right? And the Jewish students who are overrepresented because there are a lot of young American Jews who who have come to believe that their Jewish identity, their Jewish values are at stake in this struggle, that what they cherished about being Jewish was some notion of identifying with the oppressed and the persecuted because of Jewish history, or some notion that all people are precious in God's image, some notion like that. And they feel it is a very deep personal affront to their understanding of what it means to be Jewish for this to happen. It's almost like, if you wanted to be almost melodramatic about it, you could say that there's this deep struggle about what the lessons of Jewish history are and what the lessons of the Holocaust are. Are those lessons, the world is always against us, we always have enemies who wants to kill us, and now it's the Palestinians and Hamas and Hezbollah, et cetera, or is the lesson that whenever some group of people is threatened with destruction, we should stand with them because we know what that's like. And that is a very profound divide that I think you see throughout American Jewish life. You see it on college campuses between Jewish students, and you see it between many Jewish students and their own parents.
Sure, absolutely. So Peter, I mean, I'm sure, and I'll sort of end with this and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A, but, you know, everybody says that the US has so much leverage over the Israeli government's actions and the direction in which Israel is going. But I've often wondered the role of the American Jewish community and what kind of leverage it has regarding Israeli actions. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
I think the American Jewish community does have a significant amount of leverage. I mean, and one can talk about that leverage without fueling, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Jews running everything, right? We know that in American politics, we have a very corrupt political system in which money plays a very big role on all the issues, when it has to do energy policy, prescription drug policy, all of these issues. So, of course, also on this issue as well. And so the organized American Jewish community has kind of mobilized people who have significant resources. And now that we have essentially no limits on campaign finance at all, right? The impact of money is even greater than it was 10 or 20 years ago. And also there's an infrastructure, an organizational infrastructure that is built up over many years in a group like AIPAC, in which you have people who've developed strong relationships with members of Congress over decades. And that also is a source of political power. Now, again, it's not only American Jews. Christian evangelicals are a very powerful force in supporting Israel, especially in the Republican Party. But I think in the Democratic Party in particular, where you see this gap now between where the Biden administration is and where public opinion is inside the Democratic Party, part of the explanation for that gap is the political influence of establishment Jewish organizations like AIPAC. And we've seen in the congressional races, their willingness to put extraordinary amounts of money to defeat the relatively small number of members of Congress who are actually willing to stick their neck out on behalf of Palestinian rights.
Sure. I'm just going to ask you that one last question that I asked Trita as well. I mean, what difference will this election make in terms of, with Trump coming to power or Harris, which one would have a slightly different approach to Israel than what we've seen?
I mean, I think Trita makes an interesting point that perhaps Trump is more erratic. On the other hand, I think there are two things to be said for why Trump would be worse than Harris. The first is that Harris does face some pressure in her party from the grassroots and even from some Democrats in Congress. Trump faces no pressure in the Republican Party to use American leverage to stop Israel at all. So that's one reason that I think Harris faces some greater political pressure in her own party than Trump is. The second thing is that the repression of pro-Palestinian organizing, which is already quite significant, would probably be worse under Donald Trump than it is under Kamala Harris. So, I thought Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez made this interesting point when she was talking. She said, I think about which president I want to organize under. Not because of what I think the president will do, but where do I think there will be more space for organizing? I think the level of repression against pro-Palestinian organizing and organizing on a range of other issues will be the repression would be greater under Trump even than what we see now.
Sure, thank you. So, Peter, now we're just going to, we have Peter and Laila here, so we're going to turn to audience Q&A. I know Trita is going to join us whenever he can. And I'm just going to ask the audience to, again, put your questions in the Q&A function. Please do not make any personal remarks. That will not be tolerated at all. If you have a genuine question, absolutely, we will try and get to as many as possible. And so with that, I'm going to turn to Abby to ask the first question from the audience.
Good evening. Methlika, just so you know that Laila has told us she also needs to leave at 8:30.
Yes, so and I know it's 2 hours is a very long time, so I think let's try and aim for 8:30 and try and get as many questions there as possible. So yeah, so please go ahead.
Ordinarily, I wouldn't mind, but I literally just hopped off a train from New York and I have 4
I
kids
know, I heard.
on my office as I'm doing this. I'm like, oh, wait.
Absolutely, yes. So 8:30 it is.
Laila, a few questions for you. What did the court decide? And was it a U.S. court? And lastly, how are Gazans getting water and food?
With regards to the court case, as I mentioned earlier, I don't know if the person who was asking the question was here earlier, but it came down to political question doctrine that the courts can't interfere with the executive's foreign policy decision making. But again, it was part of an effort. We sort of knew that going in. It was more of an effort to a tool in the toolbox to put pressure to continue to be able to talk about what's happening, to so on. But for those interested in following it, they can go to the Center for Constitutional Rights website or social media feeds, and they have constant updates there about what's going on and the different kind of tactics that we continue to try to use to prolong this case and keep it alive. And again, it was really also about the testimonies and the record, right? And the pressure of which the collective of which continues to build, with regards to food and water, a lot of what I do, my other hat is food justice and food sovereignty work, and I always like to remind people that it's even outside of the current context and the here and now of the deliberate starvation that's happening, because long before this became sort of one of the fastest paced deliberate starvations that we're seeing, that sort of waxes and wanes. I'm going to deviate a little from the question, but I'll give you an answer, I promise. Is that why we have to ask why before we say where is the water, and why are they able to do this, right? Why and how is Israel almost instantly able to, like a switch, shut off the water and shut off the food and create such a fast-paced starvation? And that's also coincidentally happens to be the subject of Michael Fakhri's new report, the UN Special Rapporteur on Food, that he will be presenting to the UN General Assembly on Friday, is how was Israel able to starve 2.2 million people so fast? And for those of us who have been obviously working in this field and studied it for a long time, it's kind of like a no-brainer. Israel has for a long time controlled and continues to deliberately target and destroy, and for a long time has controlled Palestinian foodways and the food system, way before October 7th. This is something I talked about at length when I was doing the research for my book in 2010. All the warning signs were there. All the experts were saying it's just a matter of time. At that point in time, it was something like 80% of the population was reliant on food aid. And I remember a UN expert telling me rather presciently at the time, nobody in Gaza is starving right now. This was 2010, but everybody is hungry. And at any moment, it just takes, shutting off and again, we dig even deeper. Why are so many people dependent on aid? Again, because Israel controls, access and movement and the entry, all the supply routes of goods and all the commercial crossings, and everything about what seeds can enter. Few people know that seeds are one of the things that Israel prevents from entering, and farmers there's this really circuitous way that they're smuggling seeds in to try to get them to farmers and individuals who are trying to grow, urban gardens, rooftop gardens in the north of Gaza. And so this is a very long-winded way of saying, again, it's a symptom, right? What we're seeing is a symptom. But in terms of how people are, I'm assuming they're asking specifically about the north, maybe even Jabalia right now. I mean, the truth is, again, half my family is in the north, none are in Jabalia, but around it. But the truth is, people in Jabalia don't have access. I mean, you maybe have a limited supply that you've maybe stockpiled a few things, mostly whatever shelf-stable items were making it through. The limited number of aid trucks that were making it through. Of course, now none of them have been. In terms of water, there was a lot of efforts before, because of course Israel cut off all electricity, very limited fuel was entering to the north, which is cut off from the south. So people were funding what they call solar systems, so powering wells, which of course require diesel, which is almost non-existent. So they were powering them with solar panels and backup batteries, which of course like quadrupled in price. So would cost anywhere from $15,000 to $20,000 just to power one system for a very small group of people in one neighborhood. So that's what people have been kind of working on in terms of like mutual aid fundraisers and things like that in the north in various areas where people are sheltering. But that's not a steady supply. So people, if I could walk you through the way that it works, people have to go take gallons, empty plastic containers, whatever they have, and maybe twice a day go and fill these containers. And that is what they have to use all day long, right? For drinking, for cooking with, for washing their clothes, for bathing, and so on and so forth. And this is a daily routine, ritual, whatever that they are forced to do. And of course that runs out, you have to ration, and in terms of food, again, it depends on the week and the month. I mean, I can, tell you what various people that I've spoken with, what my family members were in the worst of months in February. They were when really nothing was making it into the north, and everything they had run out. My cousin told me that for 4 straight months he was eating whatever canned fava beans that he had, and when that ran out, he had a little bit of tahina, sesame seed paste, that he was eating that, and some lemon juice from some unripe lemons that on whatever trees he could sort of find in the area around him. And then when that ran out, it was common mallow, so kind of relying on the inherited knowledge of foraged edibles. So they were eating khubeza. Many of you might have seen this in the news. It was mistakenly referred to as grass or weeds, but they're wild edibles. So people were foraging for wild mallow, for sorrel, known as hummed or hamasis, and wood sorrel as well. And that's what they were eating for a month straight. It was, there was a joke by one popular 17-year-old young Instagrammer in Gaza who raised the mallow leaf and said, I want to talk for a moment about khubeza. This humble green has stood by us for the past month when nobody else has, kind of an homage to khubeza. So in short, it's just kind of depending on the week, on the day, on the month, how bad things have gotten. But it's just a constant struggle to survive at this point, to feed themselves, to, nourish themselves with whatever's available. But again, I urge people to also remember that when not in the news anymore, that it's just a symptom of a bigger problem of Israel's control over access and movement of all the foodways, of all the food systems, of the farms, of the fisheries, of all the destroyed pretty much like the 95% of the fishing fleet of Gaza. And on and on. That's really the bigger picture here, the bigger problem, and has been for decades.
Thank you, Laila.
Thank you, Laila. Thank you for that very detailed answer, just to give us a sense of which we can't even fathom. We cannot even fathom what the challenges are in terms of food access. So there are a couple of questions about the news that just came out today, that the Biden administration has declared that it will, or has threatened that it will stop arms transfers or limit at least some military aid if Israel does not allow access to humanitarian aid into Gaza. So I'm just wondering, Trita, you could answer that, and Peter, I'd like to hear what you think about that news that just came out today. And also about if anybody knows about where UNRWA is right now and how functional it is after all that it went through.
I'll let Peter take the question about UNRWA, but on the first one in regards to this news, I really am tremendously skeptical. First of all, we have to recognize that this is an implicit acknowledgement by the Biden administration that the Israelis are preventing humanitarian aid from coming in, which means that provision, I believe it's 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act, kicks in, which states that states or entities that are prohibiting humanitarian aid, American aid from coming in, are ineligible to receive military support and material. So this is an implicit acknowledgement by the administration itself that the Israelis are in violation of the law and that the administration is in violation of American law by continuing to provide these weapons. There is no 30-day notice necessary, given the fact that we know that the administration has known this for a very long time. In fact, their own internal investigation concluded this, yet Tony Blinken went on to Congress and lied and said that they had reached a different conclusion and continued to provide the weapons. That's the first thing. The other thing is that it's curious that this is coming out now, almost perfectly timed, to make it look as if the administration is doing something ahead of the elections, whereas in reality, the 30-day deadline is not going to expire until after the election. So given the track record of the Biden administration, I fear that it is simply warranted, it's simply naive if one does not have a significant dose of skepticism about some of these news. The administration has the full capacity to do something about this now, right away. In fact, it has an obligation under American law to do it now. Sending secret letters that are being leaked to the media that is giving 30-day warnings simply does not cut it.
Thank you, Trita. Peter, would you like to respond?
I know I entirely agree with Trita. On UNRWA, I'm not really qualified to answer. I don't know, maybe Laila probably knows more about its how able it is to function under these conditions than that I can't speak to that.
Sure. Laila, would you like to? I could ask Peter another question, or Abby, would you like to ask the next question?
Well, there's a question that's sort of a follow-up to Trita about that last one,
Sure.
which is, do you think that Biden and his administration and members of Senate and Congress will ever face charges for their role in aiding and abetting the genocide?
It's a great question. I don't know if I'm qualified to give a good answer to that, but let me, we had a webinar earlier today with Francesca Albanese, Daniel Levy, and Nora Erakat. And we did address a related question, which is that I think we're in somewhat of a contradictory period right now. On the one hand, you're seeing the South Africans taking Israel to the International Court of Justice, steps that were more or less inconceivable before. And we've had Western leaders even come out and say that, look, these laws were not supposed to be applied against us. This was supposed to be applied against non-democracies, et cetera, which of course is not on the face of it true, although that may have been the secret intent. But on the other hand, we're also seeing that despite all of these different steps, it's really difficult to see that it has had any meaningful impact on Israel's conduct. So I think it's still a significant question mark as to whether we're moving into a world in which suddenly the ICJ and institutions of that kind, international law, international humanitarian law, actually become stronger. And there are consequences if you violate them, or if we're actually moving into a world in which those institutions will continue to exist, but they will be hollowed out. There will only be symbolic victory, but in reality, they will be powerless when they're up against raw power.
Thank you.
Thank you. Peter, I was also wondering, I mean, we've seen the American government not use the leverage that it does have, right? And I'm just wondering, is there an entity within Israel, within the Israeli population at this time that has any kind of leverage on the Israeli government? Like, it seems to be, just going full steam ahead, and there's just no stopping it in terms of its violation of international law, international borders. What could provide that kind of influence?
You know, one interesting thing to remember about South Africa during apartheid was that although the global movement for sanctions and divestment was important, I think the thing that hurt the South African government the most and led some people in the elite to start to think differently was banks refusing to roll over South Africa's loans. And they were not doing it for political reasons. They were just making an economic risk calculation because there was basically an uprising in South Africa that the government could not put down. And they made a cold-hearted economic assessment. And so I think one of the stories, if I were to look for changes to happen inside Israel, it's not, I'm not saying I think this is likely. I think the thing that I think is a story that doesn't get as much comparative attention as it probably should is the question of how severe the consequences of this prolonged war are to the Israeli economy. How much the kind of foreign direct investment, the ability of Israeli startups to raise capital, the ability of Israelis to kind of move seamlessly back and forth between Israel and the Europe and the United States. I think again, and if those things I think could really be for a kind of pressure. And there is when you talk to Israelis, and there's lots and lots of conversation about people leaving. Now, how much it's actually really true that people are leaving it's hard to really figure it out. But I think it's to me less likely to come from a political movement that says this war is wrong, the apartheid is wrong, the occupation is wrong, and more likely, if it comes at all, to come because of a sense that the economic costs are becoming very, very serious to people who have influence in the Israeli, within, kind of in elite Israeli circles.
Just a quick follow-up to that. So do you believe that, the BDS movement in terms of Israeli companies, is that something that is going to be effective at that level?
I don't know whether there's evidence yet that the BDS movement how much the BDS movement is really driving this, as opposed to just economic calculations. I do think where BDS is having an impact, certainly I think one area is having an impact on Israeli academics. That you definitely see that Israeli academics feel more isolated. It's harder, they have more trouble going to international conferences. That has, I think, been a shift. But I also think that, the BDS movement, I think, is partly also been about consciousness raising and bringing issues to the fore in public debate in the West and the US. And clearly, there has been, and you can document it in public opinion, there really is a shift that's taking place among progressive Americans, and I think among young people in general. And I would imagine that that's true not just in the United States, but in Europe as well. And so I think the people who've been organizing around these issues over a long period of time, I think, have laid the groundwork for things to kick in over the last year that are really producing a shift in public sentiment. The question, though, of course, is always, because we have a political system in America that's often not very responsive to public sentiment across a whole range of issues, not just on this issue, it's hard to know that the United States government can function often for long periods of time without having to be responsive to public opinion. I mean, just look at the regulation of guns, right? The vast majority of Americans have wanted gun regulation for many, many years now, but it doesn't happen because we have a largely non-majoritarian kind of political system that's also highly corrupt.
Sure. Thank you, Peter. Abby, would you like to ask Laila the next question, or whichever questions come up?
I don't see one particularly for Laila Mehlaka.
Sure.
So there's one question here. So could you comment on Israel stating that UN, I think this is probably Trita, could you comment on Israel stating that UN peacekeepers must leave Lebanon? And do you think the UN will indeed heed Netanyahu's order?
You want me to take it?
Sure.
Why
Yeah.
don't you start?
I think, first of all, these peacekeepers are there to keep the peace. The idea that you are threatening peacekeepers to leave, the fact that Israel already has shot at them, the fact that already in Gaza, there's documentation of how UN personnel were actually tortured as well, combined with almost everything else we're seeing, creates a very clear image that this is not isolated incidents, but rather an effort to dramatically reshape international law and international norms. Many of these different measures that have been put in place to constrain states from being able to use what we would then consider excessive force is something that the Israelis have systematically tried to change, just as much as the Bush administration tried to change it back in the 2000s, in which it increasingly viewed international institutions such as the UN, etc., as constraining American power, and as a result needed to be dramatically weakened. If Israel manages to get away with forcing the UN peacekeepers out, given the fact that their mandate has not changed, has not been withdrawn, that would be a further feather in the cap of trying to hollow out the UN, hollow out international law, and truly create a world in which the law of the jungle will hold. And I think this is noteworthy for a very simple reason. We have a tradition in Washington of accusing, and that sometimes quite correctly, countries such as Russia, China, Iran, others, of being a threat to international law, seeking to overturn the order, etc. Whereas the most blatant examples of successfully doing this is actually happening right in front of our eyes with our support.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trita. I will turn to Peter just, about what Netanyahu's end game is here, but I'd like to ask Laila at this point. I mean, again, none of us can really imagine what you are enduring, what you've gone through, and all the while that you have been mourning loved ones in Gaza, you're also engaged in constant activism. And I'm wondering, to the rest of us here, where would you like for us to focus our efforts on at this point, in this moment? Like, what should we be focused on?
I mean, I don't know that I can necessarily answer that in in any definitive way. I think that it's what, I mean, I would say if one was to think about what anything positive that came out of this, if one can even use those same words in the same sentence, is that it has, I think, moved people to action. It's suddenly this is on everyone's radar, and then the fear, of course, is that when it's not, right, when it which the moment I think we all fear, when it's suddenly not in the news anymore, and not on people's minds. And so really, if I was to advise anything, it would be not any particular action, but sustained action. And again, I think back to one of the Islamic sayings, which is that the most beloved of actions are those that are small but consistent. And so that's what I would advise. I think we sometimes have this mistaken notion that, first of all, it's something with what I call the myth of immediate results. I think we get very frustrated when we're putting in all this effort and we feel like, why is it not bearing fruit, right? And then we get sad and we despair, and then we just don't do anything at all. And that's kind of, to me, the worst scenario. So whatever it is that you're doing, it doesn't have to be anything dramatic or over the top. I usually like to talk about the power of a few, and I quote Franklin McCain of the Greensboro Four in 1960, when in one of his last interviews in 2005, he said, "I'm often asked, but what can I do?" And his response was, what kind of question is that? Look around you. Once you identify what it is you want to do, don't ask the masses to help, because none of them will come. And so, again, I frequently think back to that, and I tell people, who are maybe new to this, I'm not really talking to those who might be, just, think about what it is, where you can put your energy. It may be that, where you are in whatever moment in time, age and your expertise. I don't know, that's different for everyone, right? What your entry point is and your interests and so on, what you can contribute. And just do that small little thing consistently, maybe by yourself, maybe with 2 other people in your community. It could be, you know, education. It always starts with educating yourself, right? And then informing others is what I say. And then finding that small entry point and just doing it consistently, rather than just, you know, a one-off kind of action. I don't know if that's really helpful at all, but there's so many, you know, realms in which I think we can all contribute. Some people feel like one way is more effective than the other. It really just depends. I mean, I'm happy to answer it in a more specific way if there's a follow-up, but
No, this is very helpful. This is extremely helpful. Thank you so much. Abby, did you have one for Peter?
I do. So Peter, I don't know that you can put yourself in Netanyahu's mind, but do you have an idea about what is his game plan and what is he trying to achieve?
Well, I mean, there's a kind of conventional wisdom that you often hear that Netanyahu is just interested in his political survival, and his political survival requires holding this government together and not going to elections, because his, you know, if he were to not become prime minister, he could be prosecuted, and so he needs to keep this government, including its you know, its very, very, very far right elements. Although the entire government is very, very far to the right, but the most extreme elements, like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich in the government. Although, to be honest, his polling is much better now than it once was. So some people were saying for a long time that if they went to government elections, he would certainly lose. It's not as clear he would certainly lose now. But I also think that Netanyahu has kind of, he always fancied himself to be a world historical figure. A kind of, you know, someone he thinks about himself in kind of as a Churchillian figure. And so I think he does. There is and he's also has always believed his entire political career that Palestinians don't matter, that basically that Israel that the Israel's fundamental challenges as a state were not with the Palestinians, that first it was the Soviet Union, and then now it was kind of Iran. He's basically always believed that Israel should look to solve its problems and never come to terms with the demands and desires of Palestinians. And so I think that it is possible that, you know, I think his vision for a certain point of what was going to cement his legacy was peace with Saudi Arabia. But maybe if he doesn't think that's possible now, that he will think that his legacy is going to be cemented through some action vis-a-vis Iran, military action vis-a-vis Iran and Hezbollah, that's going to destroy, you know, what he constantly describes as this kind of existential threat to Israel and to the Jewish people. And so even though he had the reputation for many years as being someone who was somewhat militarily cautious compared to some Israeli prime ministers, I'm not really sure that seems to hold now. You know, a little bit like Donald Trump, Netanyahu is becoming a kind of a more and more extreme version of himself. And again, as Trita has rightly said, he's not really facing any, no one with the power to say no is saying no to him.
Right. Thank you, Peter. Trita, just on that, I mean, the fact, and these are just sort of two questions, but they're not really related, but I'm just like picking back off what Peter said about Iran. I'm just wondering, so Iran's nuclear assets or nuclear program is not on the agenda when it comes to Netanyahu. That was just like a quick follow-up to what Peter just said. But then my real question is, in terms of Saudi, I mean, right now the region is an active conflict zone, right? But in terms of the normalization efforts that were underway with Saudi Arabia, with the UAE, and we haven't really been hearing a lot from these countries. So I'm wondering, is something happening behind the scenes that we do not know about? Can you give us some insights around that?
Let me first address the question of the nuclear program. The Israelis would very much like to go down that path, and they have for more than 10, 15 years. However, Israel does not have the military capability of being able to strike a decisive blow to some of the key sites. The United States does, but even the United States capability requires a significant amount of skill and a degree of luck in order to be successful. So the Israelis could start that campaign, but not finish it. And again, this is where it really comes down to what the message and the indications are coming from the American president. If he gives a little bit on this issue, then rest assured, I'm pretty confident that that's a path that the Israelis would probably start exploring. As to your second question, if you could just quickly remind me.
Just a sort of normalization efforts
Oh,
with
the normalization, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that this administration has done is that they've just completely obsessed with the idea of doing a normalization deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia, essentially taking the Trump-Abraham Accords and taking it to a new level. And I think they deluded themselves into thinking that this would be some way, somehow, one of those ways that you could change the face of the region. This would be historic, all of these different things, despite the fact that, of course, the track record of the Abraham Accord has been quite disastrous. The countries that have struck it has not made a significant difference. And to a certain extent, according to Biden himself, actually, October 7th is partly a result of these normalization deals, because at one point he said that he was on the verge of creating peace in the region, and Hamas did these attacks to stop that. In his view, apparently, creating a normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel that actually does nothing to actually address the Palestinian issue would be to create peace, which is exactly the logic that Trump adhered to. So the continuity between Biden and Trump here is quite striking. But because they have been so obsessed, the news of it keeps on coming out and leaves the impression that it actually is a realistic option. I'm not so sure that it is. I think they've tried very hard against all wisdom to pursue this deal at the expense of other priorities that would have been much more worthwhile to pursue. But I'm quite negative towards what the prospects are, and particularly given what has been happening in the last couple of weeks. And I want to just emphasize, they never promised that there would be a Palestinian state. In fact, the administration was almost silent on the Palestinian dimension of this until after October 7th. And then they started using formulations of a pathway to a Palestinian state. We've been on a pathway to a Palestinian state for decades. It's a pathway that leads nowhere. If anything needs to be done is to actually have a guaranteed outcome of deoccupation, what we saw in the UN General Assembly resolution that was passed in September, they call for deoccupation within a time frame of 1 year. That's not what this is. And as a result, it would in no way, shape, or form actually help stabilize the region. Let me just make one last point about this. Given the rhetoric that the administration has been using and trying to portray this as if this is something that would be welcomed in the region by some key American partners, let me just say, based on my own conversations with officials from several Arab countries that are very close to the United States, they're absolutely terrified of the prospects of this deal. And they're terrified of it for a couple of very simple reasons. They do believe that this would further shove the Palestinians under the rug, which only dramatically increases the risk of violence. But also because they fear that once Saudi Arabia has agreed to normalization, the United States will shove normalization down the throat of every other Arab state that will have very little capacity to resist it. And that will then create tremendous tensions between those governments and their own populations. So this is not a deal that in any way, shape, or form has strong backing in the region, and everyone else is just waiting for Saudi Arabia to do it so that they would have the political cover to do it themselves. Quite the contrary. They've been tremendously worried about it because they know any type of transformation of the region that is not centered on actually giving the Palestinians their right to a statehood is only going to help make matters worse, not better.
Thank you, Trita. That was very insightful. Thank you. I think Abby has one last question for Laila, and then
So Laila, I think many in this audience knew of and remember Rifat Al-Arir with deep sadness about that he was killed in December 2023. You co-edited the book Gaza Unsilenced with him. He's of course the Gaza bit. He was a poet and educator, and he wrote the poem "If I Must Die," which so many of us have heard that many, many times. What would you like people to remember about him?
Oh gosh, I had a chance to host Rifat here when he and his very dear friend Yusuf Jamal had themselves edited a short volume of stories by young Palestinian writers called Gaza Writes Back. And they came here to Maryland and we showed them around and they came to our home. And that's when I first got to meet him. And then again, of course, we worked together on the book. And I also had a chance to go and visit him and his wife in Gaza in 2019. And we had the most beautiful meal of hand-rolled maftoul, the Palestinian couscous together on the beach. And I gave a guest talk to one of his English classes, which was just incredible. And I think his message was always one of, Peter cited earlier, I don't know if it was Peter or Trita, one of them, Edward Said's permission to narrate. But I frequently, when people ask me to kind of trace the trajectory of sort of the Palestinian narrative, of how for a long time it was either, yes, there wasn't that permission to narrate, or we as Palestinians were conditioned to think that we could not narrate or nobody will listen if we narrate. And so that was something I was very conscious of when I was living in Gaza and writing a lot in the 2000s. And that Rifat, much of his career focused on as well, is working with young students in Gaza, teaching them to tell their own stories. That was the focus, the bulk of his work, is tell your own stories, narrate your own experience, on the power of stories as well. Stories as a, wielding stories as a tool of liberation. And so I like to focus on those, again, those beautiful memories and the incredible legacy that he left. And he was a funny guy and, had like many of us in Gaza, very sardonic sense of humor. And we were exchanging a lot of messages. And one of the last things that he tasked me with was actually helping publish, some of you might have read this, an op-ed by the mayor of Gaza City in the New York Times. And this was actually, very few people know this, but Rifat sent it to me. And this was maybe a day before he was killed, and said, can you please, help edit and publish this? And then he was killed. And so I took this very personally, of course, and I was very happy that we were able to make that happen. It was obviously faced a lot of backlash, but I really felt it had a huge impact, right? In terms of what that piece had said. It goes without saying, many of us know this already and knew this at that time, that this was a war that was systematically targeting everything living and beautiful in Gaza. And that's what that was about. But one of the last messages he sent me, I was asking him, I said, I just want to make sure you're alive. And I said, please, update me. And he said he was tired at the very end, the last 2 days, he was exhausted. He was going from place to place. And he said, the few things we have are running out. There's no electricity and almost no cooking gas, no vegetables and no fruits. We have a little citrus, cucumber, and tomato after the pause. It's hard to believe that there was a pause at one point, but they are very, very expensive. We use wood to cook rice or spaghetti, or eat za'atar or dates. Again, this is just about 2 months in, so none of these items exist now. We spend 5 hours a day carrying water every single day. This was to someone's earlier question about water. I've only had 3 showers in 51 days. We are 25 people in a very small apartment of 1 bedroom, and the living room and a small room with the kids, with many kids in one place. We're going crazy. And with an old grumpy man with a million conspiracy theories, it's even worse than you can imagine. Almost everyone has a rash, a stomach ache, or a fever, or all of the above. So that was really one of the last messages he sent me. And again, in addition to that, actually the very last thing he sent was that op-ed and told me, please, publish this. But that was Rifat. And I like to think he went out in the best way possible, doing what he believed in, and fighting till the very end in the way, with his words, in the only way that he knew how, and with his voice. And so, yes, we honor him, and we continue his legacy. I'm actually working on a play based on his life and his work right now. Yeah, maybe I'll end with two more things. Somebody had asked earlier about UNRWA and so I'm just going to quickly touch, if you don't mind, on two of those things, because I did get a response. I was asking Hani Al-Madhoun, who's the head of philanthropy for UNRWA USA, and he was basically telling me that they are operating out of the shelters, the schools, the remnants, I should say, of the UNRWA schools, in which many people are staying, and each of the neighborhoods has their own UNRWA representatives that communicates with regards to the availability of aid using private warehouses. So that was his update about UNRWA. Again, just doing the best that they can under the circumstances. And then somebody else had asked about, I think, what food is available, and something came to mind that I forgot to mention, which is one of Rifat's best friends. One of the other things that Rifat loved to do is volunteer at the zoo, and one of his very good friends, who's also an assistant now, one of the aides at the municipality, I was communicating with him a few days ago, and told me that they've been surviving on basil sandwiches. And I thought he was like joking, or he had gotten that confused with something else. And he said, no, it's quick to sprout. I was able to smuggle a few seeds, and so we grow it in little pots, and we just take the leaves and eat that with bread. And he was kind of joking, you'd be surprised all the different things you can do with just a little basil. So basil is one, purslane is the other, which is again a wild, highly nutritious edible. And then on a final note, I wanted to, someone mentioned in the context of normalization in the Arab countries and what could possibly happen in the tensions. I spent 2 months in Jordan this summer, which I had only ever been there in short, en route to Palestine. And it was very interesting in all my conversations with, again, mainly with taxi drivers and so on. Yeah, people are simmering. What happened at that border crossing about a month ago did not surprise me one bit. And I remember visiting a lot of fruit and vegetable markets and seeing that all the tomatoes were green. And asking why, I was told that it's because they're being shipped, the ripe tomatoes are being sent to, not shipped, but sent to on these trucks to Israel, because of course the primary source for tomatoes before this was Gaza. And in addition to being, of course, a dumping ground for Israel, it's also the main place of export of these types of things, cheap labor and produce. So anyway, that's just yet another reason. And some of you might have heard about the arrest of a Jordanian journalist today for exposing a lot of this, what many people already knew to be the case, the complicity of a lot of the companies, Jordanian companies, and all of this. But anyway.
Is there an article, Laila, that was written that we could share perhaps about the Jordanian journalist who had exposed all of this? Maybe we can, if you could share that with us, we can send this off
Yeah, definitely
to our mailing list. There's not much left to say after that, Laila, but I would just like to thank you and Peter and Trita, who actually had to jump off again because of another commitment. But I mean, we can't thank you all enough for your insights, for sharing your wisdom, for sharing your inspiration with all of us. And I know both of you who are left on the screen are doing so much to raise awareness and raise consciousness about this. And everybody who registered for this event will get a recording, and we will also send resources in terms of where you can donate right now for Gaza, also in terms of activism, what are some action items that you could pursue. I'd also like to thank Abby from MAPA for co-moderating this event with us. Again, thank you all so much, Peter, Laila, and Laila, our hearts are with you, and we will continue what we can do at this point. But thank you all so much.